So my name is Albert Ferrari, and I'm here together with Stavro Lapapa on behalf of the Energy Communities Repository to give you an overview of the national legislation for energy communities and also of the process of working on that that we've been through. Before diving into the topic, just a few words about the Energy Communities Repository. We are an initiative from the European Commission that aim to support energy communities in different aspects. First, we provided technical assistance to energy communities, thanks to a network of experts, and as well as some guidance and different documents. So we developed a toolbox in which you can find useful material from other projects, but also good practices and guidance documents elaborated by the repository. We also intend to better understand energy communities in general, and we collected data on energy communities at the European level. This helped us to build a map that you can access online, and also to develop an impact assessment on energy communities. This webinar is on the fourth topic of the Energy Communities Repository, which is policy review and analysis, and I'm going to give you an overview of what we've done first of all. The policy work of the Energy Communities Repository consisted in, say, 4 main activities. First, the policy database. So these country fishes that we're going to present with Stavroula today. Then we've developed, based on this data collection on policies, several reports with qualitative assessment, one on action drivers and barriers that is still to be published, that will be presented today by Josh Roberts, and another report, more practical, for developing an enabling frameworks in member states. We tested these insights and this policy work through workshops done with European policymakers, regulators, and stakeholders. One took place online, the other was hybrid in Brussels. And if you're interested, there might be also other documents from the repository that are worth taking a look at. We published one guidance document on one-stop shops. And in the next week, we'll be publishing another guidance document on energy sharing. Now, the intention of this presentation that we have today is to give you an overview of the objective and methodology of the work we've done on the policy database and policy analysis. It's important for us to making you go through it to understand better how to interpret and use the work of the country fishes. And then we're going to present you also the output, so the policy map, the data extracted from the fishes, and share with you a few trends or fun facts, as said earlier. So the online policy database. This was one of the first policy activity of the repository. Our objective was to establish an overview of the national development on the provisions related to energy communities in the context of the clean energy package. So looking at what the different member states have done related to energy communities. The scope of our analysis is focused on the final legislation published before the end of March 2023. That means that in the fishes, we did not include any provisions that were not applicable by then, that were commented, discussed, during that time or after. In this database, you can find information, descriptive information on whether the European member states have started developing or have developed the frameworks on energy communities. An important note, however, is that it's not intended as a qualitative assessment on whether the policies, the laws or the regulations are compliant with the clean energy package. And we do not put also any judgment on whether these provisions are sufficient or insufficient to enable energy communities, to define them or regulate them in general. So you should take these country fishes as a descriptive analysis of what the national framework says on energy communities. To go through this, what we've done is looking deeper in the core provisions on renewable energy communities as well as citizen energy communities in the clean energy package. So in the renewable energy directive as well as the electricity market directive. And we've been trying to look at the national legislation based on what are the main aspects defined and anticipated in the clean energy package. So we collected for all the member states that have a framework in place, the laws, the regulation, and the policies through desk research. We have relied mostly on direct access to text in original languages, and when needed, we translated them in English. In the link that will be sent later in the chat, you can find a fiche that will provide an overview of the framework in place for the member states. And for this, we used one common template that is the same for everyone. And in every fiche, you can find first a summary of the legislation. Then we look at the different definitions that exist at the national level, whether they are renewable energy communities, citizen energy communities, or eventually other types of energy communities. We also look at the different rights and obligations that are linked to these communities, as well as whether the member states have developed an assessment of the barrier and potential. Also, of course, we looked at the enabling frameworks and the eventual support schemes for energy communities. And towards the end, we also included eventually another section on other provisions related to energy communities. What you have to bear in mind is that if in the structure of the fiches, you don't see elements, let's see, if in the national framework, you don't see elements related to one of these aspects, this is not present in the fiche. Meaning, for instance, if we did not identify any definition on citizen energy communities, you will not see any section related to citizen energy communities in the fiche. The fiches themselves are published by batches on the website of the repository. Now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Stavroula for the rest of the presentation.
Great, thanks a lot, Albert. Hello, everyone from my side, and welcome to our policy webinar. So Albert already presented the work that we did and the methodology we followed for the national reports, the fiches. But we also wanted to make sure that we present the fiches in an interactive way. Therefore, we created this policy map that you can see now on the slides. And of course, warm thanks to Akarion, which is our partner in the repository that work on the website developments. A short disclaimer, Albert mentioned it already, but we should just want to make sure that you understand that this map does not represent the European Union's opinion on the transposition and the conformity of this national legislation with EU directives. And in general, the main aim for this policy map is not to present an assessment of whether the legislation is in line with EU provisions or whether it is sufficient to support energy communities. But the main aim of this map is to show which countries have actually some legislation on energy communities and which countries have no legislation in place, and against the benchmark is March 2023. I see Miriam already sent the policy map, and I was about to ask that she sent the links. Thanks a lot, Miriam. Feel free to click as long as I explain the main features of it so that you better understand how we framed it. So first of all, the map has a zoom in and zoom out feature. So feel free to play around and zoom in specific countries that you're interested in. And also let me explain the different colors that we used. For non-EU member states, we chose a light gray color that you can see on the map. With dark gray, we identified 4 member states that until March 2023, they had no legislation in place for energy communities. However, till now, there might have been some developments on this regard. Dark blue, we chose for the member states where the fishes are already published on the database. So you can click on them and you are led directly to the relevant reports. And you can also see some member states that have the light blue color. This means that those member states have legislation on energy communities. We have created a fish for them, but they're not yet, the fishes are not yet published on the website, but very soon they will also be published on the map and on the website. A short disclaimer for the case of Belgium, you can already see on the numbers, we have 15 fishes already published, 10 are yet to be published, and as I mentioned already, 4 member states have no legislation in place. In Belgium, we created 3 different fish, and I just want to explain why. The allocation of the responsibilities in Belgium with regards to energy and climate policy lies between the federal governments and the 3 regional governments, Flanders, Wallonia, and the Brussels Capital Region. I will not go into detail on what is the responsibility of each case, but just to keep in mind that there is different legislation on energy communities in the 3 different regions. Therefore, we also created 3 different fishes for Belgium, 1 for Wallonia, 1 for Flanders, and 1 for the Brussels Capital Region. And they also include information on the definitions that exist on the federal level. So next slide, please, Albert. Having done now this analysis of the different legislations, we also wanted to extract some of the numbers and the different elements. Albert already mentioned the structure that we followed. We don't have time to go through all the different elements, but we chose some topics to mention here today. Specifically on the definitions, we have identified that there are 20 member states that have provisions for a definition for renewable energy communities in their legislation, 17 member states that have a definition for citizen energy communities, and there are also 7 member states that have another definition for energy communities. We have also identified 15 member states that have introduced a legislation on energy sharing, with difference based on the different national legislation and the different terminology that is used. We see legislation on self-consumption, collective self-consumption, virtual net metering, and so on. There are 14 member states that have referenced in their national legislation that there will be an assessment, that they will do an assessment of barriers and potential for the development of renewable energy communities. Some have progressed with it, some not, but in 14 cases, this is mentioned in legislation. And also finally, there are 19 national legislations that mention that they plan to take the specificities of renewable energy communities into account when they're designing their support schemes for renewables. Still, in some cases, there's not much progress, but it's already mentioned in legislation. So these are some numbers, but we also identified some interesting trends, transposition trends. Thanks, Albert. So we already, I think it was already mentioned, but we identified until March 2023, 23 member states that have introduced legislation on energy communities at the national level. We have observed oftentimes that several member states start with the inclusion of primary legislation on the definitions. So what is a renewable energy community? What is a citizen energy community? While there is often slower progress with regards to the development of an enabling framework, which is, and the specificities and the specific elements of the enabling framework are included in the directives. We have also observed that often the elements of such an enabling framework and the rights and obligations for energy communities are mentioned in primary legislation, but not necessarily further elaborated with bylaws or secondary legislation or regulations on what they mean and how they should be implemented at the national level. And we also observed I already mentioned that there are 15 member states that have developed legislation on energy sharing, which is one of the activities that energy communities can engage in. But some member states focused less on other activities, for instance, on regulating other activities, for instance, energy efficiency, flexibility, e-mobility, and so on and so forth. So I will leave it up to here with regards to the trends, and we really welcome your questions. Feel free to post questions on the chat, and Miriam will regulate the Q&A section now. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Albert and Stavroula, and indeed we can dive right into the Q&A. I saw a first question there about how member states differentiate between selling and sharing energy in the national legislation. I don't know if this is something that you guys can answer.
I can give it a go. So we don't have numbers for all the different activities and how many member states have regulated a specific activity. We know that for sure 15 have legislation energy sharing, but in the inclusion of primary legislation for energy communities, they often specify which activities the energy communities can engage in. And they mention, for instance, they can engage in supply, producing energy, selling it to the grid. So they specify that this is a different activity. But oftentimes bylaws or secondary legislation is missing. If you're interested in a specific country, I would definitely urge you to check the specific fiche.
Thank you very much, Stavroula. There was another question about whether the slides will be shared afterwards. Yes, we will put them on the website as soon as the webinar is over and we have the recording available, so you can always look back through the materials. Okay, another question just came in from Guillaume in the last slide. When you say that the focus is not on other activities, could you elaborate which activities you may have in mind?
Yeah, sure. What this means is that there is further legislation and oftentimes separate legislation, energy sharing and self-consumption, but there is not necessarily an elaboration in legislation of other activities that energy communities can engage in, for instance, energy efficiency services or citizen-led renovation services or flexibility services. And what I mean is that it might be mentioned that a renewable energy community can engage in renewable energy production, self-consumption, and include there the reference to flexibility, but there is no specific legislation elaborating how energy communities can engage in this activity. So this is what we meant with the fact that there is progress with regards to energy sharing legislation, but not necessarily on other activities.
Thank you very much, Stavroula. There's a question about the energy communities map, which I'm going to answer directly in the chat so that we can focus on the policy here. There's another question, will there be work streams related to deeper analysis on barriers, points that you mentioned that weren't tackled yet?
I can go for it. So on that, as I introduced earlier, this work was mostly, let's say, data collection on policies, regulation at the national level. And based on this work, then this is where the second presentation comes, where Josh will come later with a qualitative assessment on what were the barriers, the action drivers on the policy side found at the national level. So we definitely do that, but it's in this second work stream presented later by Josh.
Thank you so much, Albert. Are there any other questions at the moment? If so, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, there will also be, we will have even more time for a Q&A after the next presentation. So if any more doubts come up in the next 20 minutes or so or afterwards, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I would hand over to Josh to share his presentation about the drivers and barriers for energy communities, the analysis that the repository has done on this. I'm going to share the presentation for you.
Thank you, Miriam. While she's doing that, yes, thank you to everybody who has come to hear about this work. It's been almost 2 years of a lot of deep reading, analysis, translation, and all of that. So I'm going to try to link the work that Stavroula and Albert presented and look more about what is in those fiches and how it looks at different barriers and drivers of different activities that energy communities can participate in. So Miriam, if you could start that off. Just to dive into a little bit of the background of the report. So as Albert mentioned, this is really about the clean energy package and what stemmed from that, from the Renewable Energy Directive and the Electricity Directive. Basically, yeah, that those two directives provide rights for energy communities to engage in activities across the energy sector. And so what we have basically tried to do with this report that I will present is to look at the barriers or action drivers that could either prevent or facilitate the participation of a particular activity by an energy community. Just for specific reference, we don't go into every single activity. I would in particular note that we have not really covered renovations or energy efficiency, and we also don't cover heating. There are a couple of references to heating in here, district heating specifically, but we don't do a in-depth analysis the way we do with other activities, which are namely renewable energy production, energy sharing, retail supply, or sale of electricity and also gas to some extent, and participation in flexibility. I would also add that flexibility, since it is a little bit, it's a more new area. I think energy sharing is also new, but flexibility is even further off in the sense that there are not many national frameworks that have been designed for that. And we actually don't have a lot of experience of energy communities participating in those activities. So we have covered that topic just a little bit differently. And it's also worth mentioning that we didn't look just at the activities themselves. Through this analysis, we also saw that there are many cross-cutting barriers or drivers that might apply to an energy community regardless of which activity it undertakes. And a lot of this has to do with just the way an energy community might organize itself and how it sort of functions. So those are some key parameters to keep in mind here. In terms of the barriers and the action drivers, we had to develop sort of a methodology for ourselves. If you look at literature, there are many different ways to group or create types of different barriers and action drivers. What we tried to do was to summarize this literature and to create a framework that made sense for ourselves in the context that we were provided with. And so we have grouped them into more or less 4 categories. One of them is the business case and the legal framework. This is really about how the legal framework impacts the ability to develop different business cases for energy communities. We sort of acknowledge, using the Renewables and Electricity Directive as a basis, that these are non-commercial market actors that integrate or organize smaller actors at the local level or through a particular interest in a particularly democratic manner, and in an activity that is not necessarily intended not to make money, but the money is going towards providing community benefits, whether that be economic, social, or environmental, as opposed to giving a return on investment to the participants. That's a key distinction there. So that has a lot of impacts about how business cases are developed, and how they pursue these business cases throughout the market. And of course, that is impacted by the legal framework. Then we look at the market structure and access. And a lot of this has to do with the legacy regulatory frameworks that have been developed over the last decades. through the liberalization process and the packages, the legislative packages that have been implemented. Now we have 3, almost 4 of them, at least in the electricity market. So how does that impact the ability for communities to enter into the market? And it doesn't just look at the framework itself. It also looks at the behavior of other market actors that may facilitate or impede access to the market by energy communities. Another is resources. This is looking at many different types of resources, whether it's financial, human resources, but it's also looking at political resources. So at the local level, looking at the involvement of local authorities, whether there's trust in the community, sort of these intangibles that really sort of just intuitively make sense about whether you can set up an energy community or not. And organizational, informal, and institutional conflicts. This also looks at cultural aspects of energy communities, whether there are likely to be, how easy is it to set up different organizational forms for energy communities, this sort of thing. So, and just to give you a quick, a brief into the methodology, we based this research on interviews. I believe we conducted around 40 interviews with different civil society organizations, energy community groups, and we even interviewed some DSOs for this. We participated in some workshops with local authorities. So really a sort of rich collection of conversations, workshops, and literature from European projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I hope that's enough in the background. If I forgot anything, you can ask me in the Q&A afterwards. But sort of just to dive in here, and I'll just gonna go through for the rest of the presentation on. I'm gonna start with the cross-cutting action drivers and barriers, and then I'll go into some of the specific headings for each of the activities that I described. So again, cross-cutting, what do we mean? It's likely to be present regardless of the activity that the energy community is engaged in. We sort of came up with 4 of these of barriers and action drivers. All of them are closely correlated, and we've tried to do that throughout the report. It's not necessarily a 1-for-1, but we tried to do that wherever necessary. The first one, by far, and it makes sense because this is a new concept legally, is the lack of a clear or uniform legal definition for energy communities. And I would add that we also include monitoring frameworks, because one of the things that we are seeing is that we need to actually look at what is being created at the national level when we are articulating these new definitions. We find that through our experience and conversations with many of you, that the principles, I mean, if you look at the definitions, they are very principles based, which means that they need to be further interpreted at the national level in order to provide clarity for stakeholders. This is not an easy process. It has not been uniformly undertaken in all member states. So there is still a lack of clarity around a lot of what these concepts means and what even some of their elements actually mean. And that has, again, created challenges for monitoring, excuse me, what has been developing at the national level. Some member states have monitoring frameworks, usually through the National Regulatory Authority, but not all of them do. And there are also issues around resources and legal authority to undertake these types of responsibilities. And then the other ones are more around sort of the information that people have available to them in order to, or the resources that they have in order to undertake any sort of project. One of the biggest challenges that we see is access to finance, and a lot of that has to do with predictability and certainty around regulations and support. For instance, traditionally, a lot of energy communities were started through the ability to access feed-in tariffs, which all market actors had, but this was relatively easy for citizens and other small market actors to access. And then once these have been changed, or if they've been changed abruptly, or if other supportive policies have have put a kink in the wheel, then we see challenges, and it's not easy for energy communities to finance their projects. Usually, they are undertaking these projects through equity shares to their members, but this is usually not sufficient, and it's usually hard to get this type of investment at the early stages. So we actually looked at a lot of the different stages of project development, and by far, I think the early stages were the most problematic. And it's also hard to get a private loan as well from a bank during this time. Also, we found that a lot of technical expertise is lacking for particularly new energy communities. They usually rely on volunteers or part-time employees, which makes it very difficult for them to navigate administrative procedures, obtain licenses, etc. And a lot of them, again, related to the lack of clarity around the concept, they don't necessarily have information about what to do, where to get this expertise. And some of them aren't even aware of what an energy community is. So we're even going back to basics here, as in like, how do I find an energy community? What is it? What does it actually mean? What is the benefit? What is the risk? This is a lot of information that people just don't have access to. And then finally, and this is it's become an even bigger topic since the energy crisis, but accessibility for vulnerable households. Energy communities we have some really good and even old examples of energy communities trying to focus specifically on either social housing or looking at or targeting vulnerable groups, with solidarity mechanisms. But by far, this is a minority of energy communities at the moment. And there are some reasons for that, whether it has to do with the lack of understanding of how an energy community actually does this, or the fact that they haven't developed the collaborative relationships with social service providers. And a big challenge is also just the ability to invest. This issue is, it's pretty simple to understand how somebody who has a low income is not going to have disposable income, but how do we overcome that? That is the real question that we try to look at. But of course, we have, because these are barriers, there are also many drivers for this. And one of the things that we've done in this report is to look at how different member states have been setting up financial schemes, again, particularly to help finance the early stage projects, but also looking at different types of mechanisms like grants or cheap loans, these types of schemes that can actually help construct projects. We also see that under a lot of European funds, like structural funds and recovery and resilience funds, that a lot of member states are funding projects, funding works, funding the gathering of expertise by energy communities. Even in Austria, there's a grant that energy communities can get to actually set up their legal form. So there are many different forms of support. Some of this comes at the national level, but there are also local level mechanisms. And I think one of the things that we also see is that as an activity becomes more understood by the private banking sector, that it becomes more of a certain investment for them and it's more interesting. Having said that, energy sharing is still a big issue because it's not a very it's hard to monetize. You can't make a lot of money off of it. Within the technical expertise, information and awareness front, there are a lot of member states that are also developing these one-stop shops. Again, we have a guidance document for that. These can both take place at the national level, but also at the local or even regional level, which we've seen, for instance, in Spain. A lot of the autonomous regional governments have started to set up their own mechanisms to help energy communities get started. This can either be done through a public entity, like a government agency, but it also can utilize NGOs who have expertise on these issues. So there's more than one way to do this. And again, regarding vulnerable households, there are a lot of interesting. We got a lot of good examples from a project called CEASE, that's Community Energy for Solidarity. And what they've been doing is basically testing out a lot of projects that serve a basis for targeting vulnerable and low-income households and replicating those across Europe. And we have been seeing that even some member states are starting to link, for instance, finance or certain benefits with targeting vulnerable households. So we are starting to see the creep of vulnerability as a sort of policy basis for supporting energy communities. If we could go to the next one. So renewable energy production, this was one of the more commonly understood. We focus mainly on probably wind and solar, not so much on biomass. But yeah, a lot of these barriers have also been well known even when energy communities were first starting to become a known topic at the European level. We found basically three basic barriers for this. One of them is the lack of sites for production. A lot of this has to do with the fact that energy communities just don't have the financial resources, or they're not quick. We see that with when you have a lot of support coming through, a lot of developers want to develop their projects. It was interesting when we looked actually in Denmark. Originally, you actually had to live around a wind turbine to be able to invest in it. And that resulted in obviously a lot of local ownership back in the 1980s and 90s. And then they opened that, and then you had a professionalized sector that's coming in and competing with smaller projects who obviously have deeper pockets to provide money for the contract for the use of the site. This can be an issue. We also looked at local authorities, so public spaces that are controlled for siting production. And we found a lot of legal barriers, mainly through the public procurement framework. It's not that it's not possible to create a procurement framework that helps energy communities, but it's very legally complex and not really that clear. And so there's a lot of legal risk that comes, and this has a sort of regulatory chill on what local authorities will do. We also looked at support schemes, mostly the move from auction, from sort of fixed administrative forms of support to more competitive auction-based or tender schemes. We mainly looked at Germany. We looked at some of the experiences from Denmark as well, and we sort of tried to highlight the challenges of moving from these more simplified support schemes that most people can access to these more complicated, competitive type of procedures, which inherently will work against an energy community because either they don't have the ability to spread risk across different projects. They have they're geographically focused, so there are many reasons why this is more challenging for an energy community. And then a lot of an actually quite popular topic at the moment, obtaining a grid connection. Again, this relates a lot to competition issues. If there's available space, this is usually done by an auction or through first come first serve. And energy communities are simply not capable, are not equipped to compete with other commercial developers for this, who are even sometimes just marketing these connections to other people. An energy community will never do this because they just want to use the connection point for their local project. And this actually has an impact as well, because it's not like a community can just go look at any place in the grid. They have limited space in what they're working with. In terms of the locality, we call it the postcode curse, I believe, in the UK. Now, again, we looked at the counter story for this, and I think one of the most interesting parts was that can really enable the growth of community production is policy objectives. This can be a non-binding goal or even target. They occur at the national level, they occur at the local and even regional level. And what this really is, it's just a policy objective that says, okay, we want to meet a certain, we want to have a certain number of projects by 2030, or we want to have a certain amount of installed capacity, or for all new projects, we are going to guarantee a certain ownership for local communities. These are all different ways that member states have integrated policy objectives. And it's really important because these policy objectives, they not only provide some political pressure for decision makers to create other policies to support the delivery of these targets, but it also provides a strong legal basis for the development of other supportive policies. So for instance, if you want to integrate renewable energy communities into your support scheme, if you have a policy goal that you need to achieve, you use this policy goal as the basis for the development of the measure, and then the measure can be assessed as to its proportionality in relation to the objective. We also looked at some local authorities that have been providing public spaces through tendering. So we looked at examples of different municipalities as they try to integrate energy communities either into tendering for public spaces or even procurement of services. And we have even looked at the case of the Belgian offshore wind tender, which is integrating energy communities. So there are some interesting developments there. And I actually believe excuse me, we will see more progress as we move forward with that. And we also looked at how member states have actually looked at integrating energy communities into their support schemes. We finished sort of the story in Germany about how they have moved towards revising their definition of citizen energy companies to make sure that communities actually have a proper space in there. And we've also looked at the Irish support scheme and how they created a tender specifically for energy communities. They've moved away from that to make it even more simple, but I won't go into that for the sake of time. And then we have also explored different ways that member states have been looking at getting a grid connection easier. Again, a lot of experience is coming from Ireland. In fact, we learned just last week when we were in Dublin that the regulator has decided to create a sort of renewable hub concept, which basically charges an energy community proportionate to the size of their project, because grid costs have really hampered those projects in the past. We've looked at how some member states are starting to allocate connection capacity for a certain number of projects or for a certain capacity of grid connections. There are a lot of different ways to do this, and I would say that most of them are still new, so we have to assess. And that is something that I will finish my presentation with, because it's important to include a lot of nuance in this and the need to actually assess different drivers and barriers. But I'll continue. If we move on to energy sharing, it's sort of, there's a big overlap with renewable energy production, but it's basically what you are doing with it that is the main difference. So instead of just selling it to the grid or exporting it, you're actually trying to consume as much of it as possible. And so again, this is also a new topic. So there are a lot of barriers, and that's not necessarily an indictment. It just shows that we're in early going. So the biggest challenge so far has been the lack of distinction for energy communities, active customers, and energy sharing. What do I mean by this? Well, basically, all three of these concepts have been sort of transposed at the national level together, and sometimes they are conflated, even though an energy community, and the most common conflation is an energy community energy sharing. The question is no. An energy sharing is an activity which an energy community can participate in, but it doesn't necessarily equate to such. But some frameworks do sort of conflate those, and that is not just a challenge because it makes energy sharing is looking more like a regulated activity, even though it should be less of a regulated activity than, say, traditional supply, but it still is taking the form of a regulated activity. Whereas an energy community you're just organizing a legal form. And those two things are very different, but they end up getting treated together, so it can make it overly complex. But perhaps even more importantly, what we see is that because there's the lack of distinction between energy communities and other different types of actors trying to share energy, it's not easy to set up an energy community. There's a reason that Austria provides grants to set up a legal entity, because it does cost money and time. But if there's no benefit from being an energy community compared to another sort of type of market actor, then a lot of people start questioning what is the actual added value of going the extra step of setting up that energy community. So that is a perceptual challenge that we are trying to overcome at the moment and in many different member states. And again, a natural occurrence of this being a new activity is that we haven't established clear duties and roles for different market actors. In this report, we've mainly looked at the roles of system operators and the different ways that they are given responsibilities and duties to facilitate energy sharing. And a lot of that is also linked to different limitations. In these first generation energy sharing schemes, we see that a lot of energy sharing, the parameters, for instance, whether it's the geographical proximity, the size of the installation, the netting period, some of these things, not so much the netting period, but how you might allocate the energy amongst your members. Some of these can be more limited, and that can create constraints or even suboptimal business models or even suboptimal impacts on the grid. So these are things that we're still trying to deal with. And then the other aspect of the roles and responsibilities is the interdependencies with suppliers. It's been kind of tricky to understand what the role of the supplier is in this, because they are just selling, at the end of the day, less energy. If energy is being shared, there's a big question of who is doing this allocation of shared energy into the energy bill so that you can reduce what you actually pay. We call this the residual supply. So what is the role of the residual supplier? Some suppliers have taken it upon themselves to add extra costs for energy communities or participants in them. And there are questions around whether this is proportionate or discriminatory or not. And of course, that is a very fine line. And then lastly, again, I mentioned energy sharing is not like a big money maker. So there are issues with how the economic benefits of energy sharing can be realized. This is basically done in one of three ways. One is you either maximize the amount you can consume, and so the benefit would be how much you actually pay for that energy. That depends on the makeup of the energy bill, the network charges, and the taxes and levies. And otherwise, you're selling what you don't share to the grid, and there are different ways that this might be remunerated. And then there's the flexibility, but again, we don't really touch that because it's not so possible. These are the main barriers, but then, yeah, we have from these 15 member states that Stavroula and Albert mentioned earlier, we do have some drivers or some good practice, some good early practice that we can show. If you could move the slide there, Miriam. Thank you. First, we have seen some member states make a big effort to distinguish between energy communities and energy sharing, and so there are some benefits to doing that. I think, for instance, in France, energy sharing, it's not actually called energy sharing; it's called collective self-consumption, and that existed before. And so you do have some benefits to being in a renewable energy community versus somebody else who's sharing. And we also have seen a lot of clarification of procedural requirements for DSOs, and I think some of that has also made its way into the ongoing electricity market design. But a lot of it has been around promoting awareness. I think there is a big question about how much or what the role of the DSO is in promoting awareness. But we have seen some good examples of, system operators setting up platforms or maps so that nearby citizens can go online and see whether there's an energy community that they can join, or what is my cost savings going to be, stuff like this. And we have seen some of them try to improve the clarity or transparency around their procedures and for registering energy sharing projects. And again, a lot of we do see more and more system operators putting in place the IT infrastructure. What this basically means is, so the DSO can basically monitor the metering data that comes from the production and the people who are sharing energy community. They can use that to calculate the energy bill, and that they can send that to the community itself and to the residual supplier. And I think we've also seen that as energy sharing becomes more acknowledged and it becomes a wider practice, we have been seeing regulations sort of start to become more flexible in terms of parameters. I think Italy is a good example of that. I think many of us are waiting for the next iteration of that legislation, which is, I think the ink has been dry, but it hasn't been officially published due to reasons beyond the Italian government's control, I think. But yeah, it is moving towards a more broader way for energy communities to be able to set up their projects. And yeah, and then we've also seen some examples. This is more from the sector itself, but cooperation between suppliers or even other market actors to facilitate energy communities, whether it's providing a balancing responsibility or other digital solutions, platforms, this sort of thing. And we also, on the network charges, this is a very polarizing issue, but we have seen, and I do want to emphasize that this is mainly on the volumetric. So this is what you're actually consuming, not your necessarily capacity requirement, because we all want to make sure that we pay for the grid and that everybody is fairly contributing to it. But especially in Austria, we have seen that some energy communities can benefit from reduced network fees for energy that is shared. And this is basically depending on which part of the grid you reside on or that you're connected to. You can receive different forms of a reduction on that. And the closer you are to the installation, the more you would save on that. So this is also interesting. Again, we don't come up with any conclusions on what is the best because all network charges and energy bills are all composed differently in each member state. But we just cite this as an example of what you could do. And then we look at investment support. So we look at how to connect this network charge issue with what you actually get remunerated for the excess production that you sell to the grid. Again, Austria is a good example because they provide a fixed feed-in tariff. You don't have to negotiate with the supplier. You don't have to enter into a PPA. You basically get guaranteed a feed-in tariff for up to 50% of your production. And that's an important thing to point out as well, because as we move towards a world in which we want the energy system to be more flexible, we don't necessarily want to encourage everybody to just produce and send to the grid. Otherwise, we're not really reflecting the system that we need. And so there is a question about how to balance this support for selling with the need to try to optimize consumption, which will provide a benefit. Okay, I'm going to try to move a little bit quicker here. We also have touched on supply. So this is really about supply. We're talking about retail supply. Yeah, community. Yeah, there we go. So either entering into a PPA, selling directly to somebody else, which you often need a supplier's license for, or if you're operating on the wholesale market, which basically means you're buying or selling on the wholesale market to supply your members. This is pretty much done by energy cooperatives. So for this, we actually did a survey of cooperative suppliers to see what their main barriers were. And they were pretty broad, but also quite deep. The first was simply just obtaining a supplier's license. Going back to the beginning where we look at the sort of legacy regulatory frameworks, these have really been set up for large centralized production and supply capacity. And it hasn't necessarily reflected the new landscape of market actors that we have today. And so it's often very difficult or cumbersome to obtain a supplier's license. A lot of it has to do with the responsibilities that you need to meet, but a lot of it also has to do with like a guarantee requirement or collateral that you have to put up, which often just doesn't exist. And we're also talking about supplying a small amount of customers, which if you look at the regulation for retail suppliers, they are really meant to serve a group of customers where you have a sufficient amount of customers already. It's hard to build that supply model over time. And then again, operating as a supplier, again, guarantee requirements. It's mostly around the financial guarantees that are difficult, and hedging requirements. We've seen this in particular during the energy crisis, that energy cooperatives often hedge in a different way. It's not necessarily about the amount of guarantee that you have to meet what you need to buy on the market. it's more for an energy cooperative, it's more about you hedge yourself by having as much of your own production as possible and basically limiting your interaction with the wholesale market. And regulation doesn't necessarily reflect that. And then we looked at PPAs. A lot of this has to do with the fact that we are talking about smaller market actors, and that the ability to finance projects through PPAs is just not very attractive, particularly if you need private financing. But we have been, there are some interesting trends in to overcome these barriers, action drivers. We do have experience from several member states, and one that I would like to point out in particular in Belgium, in Brussels, they are, next slide, please. There are examples of experimenting with exempting community suppliers from certain requirements. I think there are certain requirements that we have found that you absolutely need to have, and this is around security of supply and consumer protection. But if you are supplying a very small amount, we are getting to a point where regulators are becoming a little bit more relaxed about this, as long as it's done within certain parameters. So, for instance, in Brussels, you have a new regulation for small suppliers that allows them to take on some responsibilities just to get into the market. And then if they want, they can undertake the full responsibilities and become a full-fledged supplier. And we do have some more examples of providing flexibility in complying with regulatory requirements, although we haven't necessarily see that reflected in the hedging. I think that is also in the market design, so that might actually change. So there might be an impulse at the national level for that. But we also see some regulators are trying to provide assistance. For instance, Bruegel in Brussels has created a guide to become a licensed supplier, or even to meet the requirements for being an energy community. So regulators are starting to see their role as a more facilitative actor, although I'm sure that's controversial to some people. But we've also looked at how energy communities can procure services from other market actors. Some legislation, not necessarily in the EU, but in the UK and in California, they are starting to look at requiring suppliers to supply locally owned, produced energy by energy communities as a service back to the members. That is kind of an interesting example, because it just gets, it sort of sidesteps the question of whether you should set up a supplier or not. And it just simply says, traditional market actors, you should provide this service, so that the community doesn't have to do it. That's one way to do it. But then, there's also the professionalization approach that I just mentioned. The last activity I'm going to mention, and then we can I'm just going to go quickly here, because I think there's probably a lot of questions on the presentation. So we've looked at flexibility. We basically looked at this from two angles. We looked at it from the perspective of energy communities. The barriers there are not so regulatory based. It's more like practical issues. So for instance, there's just not a high demand from energy community members for flexibility services. A lot of that has to do with remuneration and the fact that it's not valorized. And that's a knock-on effect from the lack of regulation. But it's also technically cumbersome. It's kind of high cost. The markets are not necessarily mature, and energy communities themselves have not necessarily developed sufficient IT or marketing skills to be able to exploit this value for their members, although they're testing this out. But in terms of the regulatory and market barriers, we were really unable to look at any sort of barriers that impact energy communities specifically. What we basically did was provide an overview of the barriers for accessing flexibility services or markets by smaller market actors. And this is a big challenge, mainly because we're talking about exploiting household loads for flexibility, and these are very small. And so you need to collect a lot of them. And so this doesn't necessarily match with the sort of thresholds that allow for participation in these different markets. And we're still just very behind in terms of local flexibility procurement by local distribution system operators. So I'm not going to go into all of these in depth. It's just sort of there for you can look through it more in the report. If you can go to the last slide, Miriam, we do talk about some of the drivers. These are more focused on looking at the barriers or the action drivers for allowing for consumer flexibility to enter into the market. Although I would say regulatory sandboxes has been a very useful tool for energy communities in particular. I think I'm gonna leave it there. I did have an announcement, but we can wait for the end. And that's kind of this. One of the things that we've done is the barriers and drivers, but we've also got a couple of other reports. One of them is specifically on energy sharing, and another is a roadmap. So we saw some member states that are very, very far behind or just getting started. And so we've created a report that uses even more examples from member states, especially around the definitions. It should serve as a roadmap for member states that are really sort of still at the starting line, and it's kind of a guide for them to be able to navigate how to step by step build an enabling framework rather than just going full on. Because actually we've seen from a lot of member states that they have moved slowly over time. It's not like they just wholesale revise their framework and then voila, it's done. It's an iterative process. So I'll stop there, and I apologize already for speaking too long. I hope this was a useful presentation and interested in the questions.
Thanks a lot, Jos, and actually there are a lot of questions. So I can start already with the ones that are in the chat, and I would also urge you all to add your questions in the chat so that we have an overview there. The first question states that a barrier identified in many countries is the administrative burden. So administrative complexity, number of intermediaries, and so on. So which makes it difficult to develop an energy community. Do you know a country where this is not the case?
Do I know a country where it's not the case that an energy community suffers from administrative burden? I do not. I don't think they exist. I do think that some member states have facilitated this more. For instance, I mean, Austria, I think just talking about the financial burden of setting up a legal entity, that in itself is already an administratively cumbersome burden. And it's not an issue for them because they basically fund it. They subsidize it. I talked to the Wallonian regulator actually, and they said that the same thing. They're supporting the setup of these. I mean, I think there are, but this is like hitting if everything is a nail, then everything is a hammer. We do actually, one of the DSOs that we interviewed for this, they were basically saying we need to get away from this, and this is probably a warning for everybody who's involved in setting up frameworks for energy sharing, is that there is kind of a worry or a concern that energy sharing will just end up at the end of the day being a very regulated activity, and that you will need third-party service providers to do stuff for you. Like we won't have energy communities doing things for themselves. But there are ways to set that up through platforms and stuff that do simplify the process. So I think we also need to realize that we need to move more towards simplifying the process. A lot of the guides have been useful to that effect. In the roadmap that we will produce, hopefully there will be examples of one-stop shops. So it's usually housed by a certain agency, and they will, on their website, they will have model contracts there. They will have the application form. They will tell you what you need. So there are ways to make it easier so that all the information you need and have is in one place. But I would say that we still need to go further. For instance, I mean, if you're a housing association, should you need to set up a new legal entity, even though you're not, you might be a quasi-legal entity or something? Like, I think there are ways to make this rational so that we don't have to over-complexify everything. But that's probably a little bit further down the line.
Yeah, and on the simplification that you mentioned, maybe some examples could be found on the one-stop shop guiding document. So Miriam, if you want to share this link already and people could have a look, if you guys are interested on that. There is another question, should geothermal be added at the list of renewable energy resources? Isn't one of the best and generally forgotten?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's inherently covered because if we're looking at the renewables directive, geothermal is a renewable energy source. So in principle, this can be used for production, either for electricity or for heat. And I would say even, again, I just want to mention we didn't really cover district heating. Part of that was due to a lack of time, but I can also say that there are some other European projects that are actually looking at this issue. So it's a gap, but it's not a gap for long. So certainly, and I would also say that in the new, we right now we're just talking about the clean energy package. We're not even talking. We haven't even entered the Fit for 55 discussion. And I think there are even more provisions for energy communities and district heating in the new renewables directive that was officially published like 2 weeks ago. So I would have a look at that for more. But certainly geothermal is it's overlooked, but it shouldn't be.
Thank you. There is also useful information shared in the chat with regards to Austria permitting procedures. There is another question, will renewable energy communities be integrated in the offshore wind auction in Belgium?
I think so. Yes, I mean, the legislation is already in place. And as I understand, they are just working on the technical specifications. Although I also understand there are some legal issues. I think part of this legislation has been challenged by the Constitutional Court, not because of energy communities. It's something different. It's an issue between the federal and the regional governments of Belgium. So I don't have all the information, but yes, as far as I understand, they will. And again, even on the new renewables directive, there's actually a provision that allows member states to include energy communities in cross-border cooperation on offshore. So I see this as an area that will develop over time. So but look at Belgium, yeah.
Another question, suppliers state that empowered customers should not by energy sharing negatively impact their commercial business model. How to deal with this?
Yeah. So this is a good question. There are two aspects to this. One which I empathize with, the other not so much. One of them is just market dynamics or how customers act, their behavior. Behavior can change over time. This is not something that suppliers have necessarily grumbled about. For instance, if I don't know, if I have a smart energy management system and I end up using less energy, then I actually get money back from that from my supplier because I've consumed less. Or if I leave and go on vacation for a month, I'm not using what my supplier has matched my profile for. So there are natural changes that can occur. I think energy sharing should be seen just like this as anything else. And yes, the supplier is selling less, but that doesn't have to do with anything but real life. So I think that is something I would say we should feel less empathetic about. What we have seen, and this is a regulatory challenge, but there is a solution, and that is that a supplier still has to supply the residual energy, and they still have to build the customer. So the question is, how much burden is this actually imposing on the supplier? If you look at the consumer, the profile and how it impacts the supplier's balance, again, this can be done through forecasting and algorithms. But if the supplier, and in some cases this is reality, the supplier receives the data from the DSO on shared energy, and they have to do the calculation on the energy bill. This is an administrative task which the supplier has to undertake, and it costs them to do that. So as far as I'm concerned, they have every legitimate expectation to recover that cost. Having said that, they don't have to have that role. The DSO, the system operator, actually in some member states is responsible not just for collecting the data, but for doing that calculation, that allocation. And they just send the data to the supplier, and the supplier then issues the bill based on the data that has been provided to them. I think that is a much, it doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves a lot of them because it sort of removes the supplier from having to do something that they don't necessarily want to do. And I think it also more squarely places the DSO in that facilitative role, because in all cases, unless it's like a independent data hub, some member states actually have this, it's the DSO that's collecting the data. They're in the position to do stuff with it and then to share it with the other market actors to make sure that it can take place. But I hope that was a sufficient answer.
So maybe a question that could follow up. Did you encounter instances of private sector actors playing a positive role, action driver in the development of energy communities?
Oh, indeed, yeah, and these examples are highlighted in our report. I think most of them come from actually DSOs, which is I think encouraging, and a lot of it has to do with providing, developing trading platforms or providing facilitative services. One of the biggest areas is also in just being a BRP, being the BRP for the community. In a lot of countries, they don't have a lot of choice, but this is something that communities will rely on other market actors to do. So, yeah, certainly there are examples of this.
Great. And another interesting question, is energy sharing being used to alleviate energy poverty? And indeed, we have examples of that. Some legislations already point out that, for instance, it is allowed that the energy produced in order for a self-consumption project the excess kilowatts can be used and provided for free to energy poor households. So we have examples on this regard, and in some cases already in legislation. Another question that Albert or Jos, you can go ahead. It says, is the main aim for the EU definition of energy communities having access to energy or ownership of energy assets projects?
I can
So is the
start.
question? Yeah.
And then, okay. I mean, on the EU definition, the work we've done was really not directly on this, but to quickly reply, the main definition between what collective self-consumption, jointly active self-consumers, and energy communities is in the sense that the framework is very similar, but the main difference is on the ownership of the assets and on the governance aspect of energy communities. So in that sense, yes, the main aim is the main aim of the definition is focused on ownership, governance, but also on the purpose of the community itself to provide social, environmental, and economic benefits to the members.
Yeah, what I would say, and I'll be very careful in saying this, is that if you actually look, I think I agree with Albert. I mean, the main impetus for energy communities is to take ownership either over production assets or services you're providing to your members. I think I've heard some stakeholders question about whether this requirement applies to citizen energy communities. At least with energy sharing, the language is sharing is a right, facilities owned by the energy community. So, and I think if you're being true with the spirit of the law, it is about ownership. Having said that, some member states have been more lenient, so they might allow third-party owners or through leasing. This is a very gray area, which I will not opine on in this forum. Just to say that that is happening, and it's a question about which direction we are going to go to, because I think in the clean energy package it was very squarely framed around ownership, but some member states have been more flexible, especially when it comes to certain configurations. And one thing I would say is that when we're talking about access to vulnerable households, are we talking about ownership or are we talking about access? And this is where I think our world, our ideal world, needs to match with reality, and that is that not everybody is taking ownership. Maybe we don't. This doesn't need to be a rigid rule. If there are people who cannot invest, they should still be able to participate. What I would say as somebody who supports the development of energy communities is that we should be trying to include these people, not just so that they can access the energy, but that can also be empowered. But here I think it's a little bit special. Yeah.
Thank you both. Another interesting question. Have you examined whether the differentiation of the definition and regulations for citizen energy communities and renewable energy communities in member states is a barrier or an action driver? So the different, the existence of the two definitions and the different regulations between them, is this a barrier or an action driver?
I think it depends on which one you're trying to go for. I think some of this is I think that the existence of two definitions has certainly been a barrier to the efficient transposition of legislation. That's because in addition to energy communities, active customers, collective self-consumption, you have two definitions of energy communities which are not necessarily entirely coherent with each other. And so I would find that is a barrier. I won't say what needs to be done by that, at least not here. Yeah. So but we also need to understand, I think, that these concepts are just developing, and citizen energy communities are a lot more open, and they allow a lot more, professionalized market actors to come in there. So one thing we probably do need to be aware of moving forward is whether or not, by the emergence of citizen energy communities, that we somehow see an imbalance between the power of renewable energy communities to enter into the market, because they are more limited in terms of who has to participate, the democratic governance requirements, and that could hamper them. So that's something that's probably worth keeping an eye out for.
And then there are two questions that are linked to each other, so I will mention them both. The question is, how come big oil companies like Total can register as a renewable energy community? I understand this was not the purpose of the European legislation, but it is a consequence. And the follow-up question is, are there any good legislative protection examples against big companies taking over citizen energy communities in general? Maybe I can briefly give it a go, and you guys could come up if you have anything to add. So indeed, if you observe and read the recitals of the directives, it is evident that the aim of energy communities is to make sure also citizens are able to participate in the energy market and get empowered and active in this regard. We have some legislations that try to deal with the phenomenon of corporate capture that they identified at the national level. I will give the example of the German support scheme. There is a definition of citizen energy companies there, and they have included some criteria and some percentages that in the participation, the governance, and the decision making, there should be, if I remember correctly, 70% of citizens and natural persons participating to make sure that citizens are empowered and participate and are supported. So I could also leave it there. I don't know if someone else wants to give it a go.
Yeah, I think, I mean, at least in the renewable energy community definition, under Article 22, paragraph 1, member states do have the discretion to further restrict participation by private market actors. And some member states have done this. I think France is a good example of that, where they do sort of separate like who can participate and how. Some of that is through the through the autonomy requirement. I think the autonomy requirement is probably the best example of how member states are dealing with these questions. But maybe just to add to something Stavroula said, like in the Germany definition, this was the response to corporate capture. So you can see how they tried to address that. And a couple of other member states have also added minimum participation requirements from citizens to make sure that they're not just being developed by companies. So that should be more apparent in the roadmap report that we are coming out with. But yeah, it's a big question. We can't answer that whole question fully right now. You're muted.
Stavroula, you're
Stavroula.
muted.
Oopsie. Thanks for flagging it. Another question, are there any examples of indigenous peoples communities forming energy communities? Perhaps Finland or the US, Canada, and so on. If you know.
Yeah, I don't know any from Europe, but I know that yeah, you do have community projects that are being developed in the US by Native American groups. I don't have any off the top of my head, but I've read many article where they were mentioned. So yeah.
Let me check if there is anyone else, any other question, because I think the logistical question was already replied by Miriam. So Miriam, back to you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Stavroula, Josh, and everybody also to all your questions. Sorry. I think it's been really really interesting to see the questions that you have, the elements that you think about. I hope you've been able to get answers to most of them. If you have any follow-up questions, obviously feel free to contact us at the repository's email address, which you can find on the website. And we'll also make sure that we share the presentations and the recording with you afterwards on the website. So if you want to play back on anything or go back through the presentations, you'll be able to do that. So yeah, I think all that's left is to thank everybody, the speakers, and all of you for your interest, your contributions. We hope this has been helpful for you, and we look forward to staying in touch on this topic in the future as well. Wishing you a very lovely day, and see you soon in one form or another.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
for coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.